Okay, go for it. Thank
Perfect. So the title of my talk today is Increasing Psychology's Contribution to Mitigating Climate Change. In that sense, it's a pretty bold title. And I don't know if I have enough to say to legitimize the title, but you can tell me afterwards if I don't. Sorry. So my talk today is really like similar to most of my papers, at least the ones that have attracted the most attention. They're sort of a perspective kind of talk. So I'll share, I think, my thoughts about where psychology should go if they want to maximize the impact. So my target group is really psychologists, but I think I can also say behavioral scientists who are interested in mitigating climate change. And particularly, I'll focus on behavior and not necessarily other very legitimate research topics. So that could be understanding how people perceive climate change as a phenomenon, the risk they perceive as being central on whether they should act or not. For example, whether that could be their livelihoods or responsibility in tackling mitigation. I'm not going to talk about climate adaptation. Obviously, increasingly with climate change already happening and already we see quite serious impacts, this is a very worthwhile thing to study. It's just not what I'm going to focus on today. And I honestly I know much less about adaptation than I do mitigation. So I hope that sort of frames my talk. So the central premise, essentially, of what I'm going to talk about today is that I think mitigating the existential environmental problems we face, and that's climate change, but it's also biodiversity conservation. I'll focus on climate change, but the other one is equally problematic. But it fundamentally hinges on essentially changing human behavior and human activities. And that's what we do in our communities. It's the products and services we demand. It's how we organize society. It's the companies that produce these products, etc. But within all of this, I would argue, is essentially human behavior. But what is also, I think, true is that so far, psychologists haven't really had that significant a role in one, sort of informing international research collaborations around mitigating climate change. The prime example of that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but also, let's say, UNEP, for example, they have a report recently where they looked at the gap between emissions or the pledged emission reductions and where we actually at. Within that, psychology doesn't really feature that strongly. In the IPCC, we're seeing, I would say, a positive change. So psychologists are becoming more involved, but say relative to economics or sociology even, our role is pretty minor still. But this could change over time, hopefully. And we see this with same if you look at the policy domain. So psychological research haven't really had that much of a role in informing, particularly intergovernmental, but also national policy development and implementation. Obviously, there are exceptions to this, including in the UK sometimes, depending on who's in charge of the government. But nevertheless, it hasn't really featured that strongly. I think, so my personal point of view is that psychologists should play a much greater role, but obviously we need to justify this by the quality of our evidence in terms of how much can we actually say that are relevant for fast-tracking climate change mitigation. And hopefully what I'll talk about now is to set up, I guess, many of the different avenues where psychology could play a much greater role. So what I really hope to achieve with the talk is, one, to pinpoint areas of improvement. So where do I see as being what I perceive as weak spots in psychological research? And the intention with this is really to make sure or prompt like a reflection, are we really dedicating our attention to the research questions that matter the most? So in other words, do we have the eye on the prize? Because mitigation has to happen so fast that we really don't have much time to waste. And I think this is probably a really good point to stop up and think, are we really able to deliver that? Or what we do at the moment, is that able to deliver that? So instead of moving us forward, I boldly will offer 9 different recommendations for what I see as being potentially able to stimulate more impactful psychological research. So just before I get into these 9 different recommendations, I thought I'll tackle the beast. I'm only going to do it very briefly because it's a discussion that comes up in media, on Twitter, wherever, probably also in private conversations all the time. So to tackle climate change, do we need individual change or system change? And obviously you could sort of sense from also what Esther told in the beginning, I think these are inherently interlinked and it's not either or. And I don't think it's productive to talk about it as an either or thing. But nevertheless, it's something that's advocated all the time. So it was just last week, for example, in the British Medical Journal, there was an opinion piece essentially more or less dismissing the role of individuals in mitigating climate change. And we see the same as articles, opinionate. So one who's always been a little bit skeptical of individual action is Michael Mann, the climate scientist professor, who's been a major figure in the climate domain for a long time. And so on. And it could also be like climate activists. Some of them still have the argument that you shouldn't really do much as an individual. We should only focus on changing the system. But I hope you take away from my talk is that individuals are embedded within the system, and we can't change the system without changing the individuals that form that system. So the first recommendation I have, and I think the intention with this is to sort of set the scene or frame the scope of where individuals fit into that system. So in psychological research and much of behavioral science, actually, we've tended to focus on what individuals do as consumers. And this is not only a bad thing. So we need to change certain consumer behaviors no matter what. So because these are central to mitigating climate change, I'll get back with some example of which these are. But we cannot mitigate climate change without fundamentally changing many consumer behaviors. Not all are equally important, but some are very important. So it's not that focusing on consumer behavior is illegitimate, because it certainly is legitimate. It's just individuals are way more than just a consumer. In fact, there are many other roles where individuals can act to help mitigate climate change, but they can also help prevent it. So individuals can also actively work against climate action, whether that's, for example, preventing wind projects from happening in their local community. It could be lobbying against climate solutions within your company, against policymakers, etc. And I'll get back to this sort of role later on. But generally, what I say when it's multiple roles could be what we do as citizens. So, for example, engagement in social movements. It could be obviously voting is one, but also if some of us are, I'm not, but other people are farmers, for example. It could be landowners. Some of us who has money, we invest money either in pension funds, on stocks or bonds. We are members of different organizations, whether that's formal employment as an employer or employee. We can affect climate mitigation activities in all of these different roles. And they vary, the potential vary, and I'll get back to that a lot. But nonetheless, there are individual relevant factors that we could study as psychologists within a much wider array of societal realms than just what we do as consumers. So I think just equating individuals with consumers is an unproductive strategy, and one that undermines the role of psychology, I think, in climate change mitigation. So my hope is really that here is like, if we can acknowledge that there are many different roles that individuals can undertake, this sort of broadens the realm of psychology and also highlights that we actually, if we do the correct or like valuable research, we can contribute with a lot of knowledge to intergovernmental research collaborations or intergovernmental or national policy making as well. The second recommendation, and this is one that Cameron, who's also in the audience, and I have been banging on about, really sort of piggybacking off Paul Stern, has been one of the leading figures in the climate domain, like psychologists in the climate domain for 40 years. So we argue that there's been too much emphasis on psychological theory instead of the environmental impact of the behaviors when we set research priorities. So it's quite common. I see psychologists say, okay, we have this theory. How can we then show that this has some sort of predictive validity or value with a climate relevant behavior. So you come from rather the psychological theory, rather than you say, is this behavior contributing or relevant for mitigating climate change? And I think this tendency to look mostly at the theory, or the starting point being the theory, is that we have ignored certain behaviors. And unfortunately, these behaviors we've tended to ignore have quite a high impact on the climate or other environmental impact indicators as well. And it's sort of disincentivized actually having to learn more about what are these impacts and the scale of them. So the literacy among psychologists in terms of the climate literacy of psychologists are not always that great. And that also means that the research, which is increasingly accumulating, that shows that people generally don't really have a clue about which behaviors matter in terms of mitigating climate change. I think to some extent that's also true of psychologists. And I'll just show a few graphs in a moment to say what are, or indicate what are some of these, I would say, low impact behaviors that people have a tendency to think are really important, or think are somewhat important at least. But if we ignore the climate impact of the behaviors we study, it also means that our evidence, as a consequence, becomes of very little relevance to researchers in other disciplines, but also policymakers who are keen on actually fast and ambitiously mitigating climate change. So just to give you a few examples of what I mean when I say low impact or insignificant consumer behaviors, but we've been told for quite a long time, right? You shouldn't use a plastic bag when you go to the grocery store. You should bring your own cotton bag. The time it takes for the one plastic bag to, or for the one cotton bag to, climately speaking, pay itself off, it depends, but it could be 200 plastic bags, for example. And plastic bags are a problem, just not really in the area of the world where we live. So plastic pollution, it does come in our area, but it's mostly driven in Asia and Africa. So it's not, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but just know that it's not like a very impactful behavior. And the same with showering your shower. So we've been told this, save water when you go to a hotel, for example. You can also be told, sometimes they have these lighting shower heads that tells you how long you've been showering. This, from a climate mitigation point of view, is not that big of a deal, really. It is obviously in drought-prone areas. So again, it sort of speaks to a context-specific evaluation. But generally, it's something you should do for sure. But again, it's relatively low impact. And the same with turning lights off. We've seen, what was it, like a decade ago, we saw a massive shift to LED light bulbs, and that actually had an impact. So simply just switching rather than sort of curtailing use can be meaningful, but generally these are relatively low impact behaviors. And I always include this graph in my slides, and some of you have probably seen it before. It's from Seth Wines and Kimberly Nicholas, who published a paper in 2017. That guy got a fair bit of attention, I would say, for good, and I think if you ask them, not always great reasons. So the reason they got a lot of attention was that they ranked the different behaviors in terms of consumer behaviors in terms of their impact on the climate. And the one they ranked as having the highest, or found that had the highest impact, was having one fewer child. So obviously that's quite a controversial statement, and one that's very context specific. But if we sort of set that aside for a bit, generally, if you look towards the right of it, you see that these high impact behaviors are generally linked to mobility. So driving much less in cars. Flying, at the individual level, flying is the most impactful behavior you can do, consumer behavior at least. And you also have switching, so diets is another one. So switching away from particularly red meat does matter a lot, also for biodiversity. Agricultural production is by far the biggest impact on biodiversity, but also what we do in households, how we heat and cool our houses. And all the way to the left, you see, like, for example, recycling. Whenever you say something, or ask a person, or if you ask a person on the street, what is the thing you can do to protect the environment, they would likely say recycle. And that's because it's something we've heard for 30 years. And again, it's a good thing to do. It does matter. It's just not relative to the other behaviors on the right that impactful in actually mitigating climate change. But now I also said that there are many things we can do in other roles that are not linked to what we do as consumers. So I'm not going to delve too long on that, but I do want to point out that calculating the impact of different behaviors sometimes become a bit more complicated. And the reason for that is that the impact on climate typically occurs more indirectly. So for example, if we promote climate activities in organizations, it will be the organizations who, for example, rewrite the supply chain requirements that ultimately leads to different products being supplied and the impact of those products. So the impact would ultimately be more indirect. If it's a farmer changing behavior, it will be more direct, but nevertheless, it can be a bit more complicated. And there was a study that came out later, was it earlier this year, last year? I might have got the year wrong, by Seth Rines and colleagues that tried to actually estimate what is the climate impact of a citizen action like voting. So if you vote, what could be the climate impact of that one single activity? And obviously this is very complicated and it varies a lot between what country you come from, the emissions emitted from that country, whether it's a democracy in the first place, etc. But it's something that can be done, and it's nevertheless something that one should think about when we decide which behavior we should study. But we should also be really mindful that the climate impact of our actions will vary a lot between individuals, but also our different roles and the context within we find ourselves. And I'll get back to some of these later on. But the reason we still cannot ignore it, even if it's complicated, even if it's not precise, we should always be mindful of what is the impact. Because if we care about solving climate change, the impact is what matters. It's not behavior. Behavior induces or causes an impact in the climate. So ultimately, the outcome variable should be the impact, I would argue at least. So my third recommendation would be that we shouldn't forget infrequent behaviors. So we have a tendency, partly because we're psychologists, to look towards behaviors that are quite frequently performed. And as just shown, some of them have high impact. That could be, for example, car driving. It could be food choices. But some of the behaviors that are really high impact, like air travel, or what sort of house we purchase, or what sort of vehicle we purchase, or how we invest our money, is less frequently performed. And that sometimes means it's not perfectly square with the conventional psychological study, because it just happens much less frequently. So it's harder to gather the data. But these one-off decisions can really lock in very emission-intensive behaviors. For example, the car, obviously, if you buy an electric vehicle versus a diesel or very fuel inefficient car, every time you use it, essentially emits more. Or if you buy a house in a suburb, you might lock yourself into relying on that car more because there might not be functional bus routes, or there's a long way to work. You'll probably get a bigger house, so it will also use more energy. For example, if you build your own house, you make a lot of decisions, for example, in terms of heating or cooling, like insulation, the materials you get, etc. So these one-off decisions can lock yourself in for quite a long time. But these behaviors are rarely studied with among psychologists. And as I said, one, just because of the frequency, that they are quite infrequent, that might be a reason. But psychological factors are still relevant. So there are people in Switzerland, for example, with Hanno, who've looked at how people perceive like electric vehicles and, for example, range anxiety, where people fear that they're not going to have enough electricity to get them to the destination, etc. So these can be studied with some sort of psychological approach, but they're just rarely done that. So I would like to see, obviously, much more research focusing on these behaviors as well. Don't completely disregard the frequently performed. Definitely not, because they're still relevant. But we shouldn't forget the other ones because they have high impact too. So structural factors, I guess it sort of reflects the interactions between the individual and the systems. So I think we should just come out square and say, as psychologists, yes, psychological factors are really rarely the most important predictor of any high impact behavior. And I think that's fair to say. So psychological factors might, for example, be relevant in predicting what sort of a house you get. but it's not the only reason. Nor the same with food consumption. Psychological factors are not the main predictor. But that doesn't mean that they're not insignificant and we shouldn't study it. But I think we should be transparent about that, even though we are psychologists and obviously want to show that psychological theories and phenomena are relevant for solving societal problems. We can still do that while showing humility in terms of its importance. So, but even if we are psychologists who are interested in changing behavior, there are many different features of the structure. So you can disaggregate that. For example, the physical environment, whether it's macro environments or micro environments. So macro environments, for example, is availability of healthy food stores or vegan or vegetarian options, for example, within the environment. It could be infrastructure, sort of cycling lanes, public transportation, all of that. This can also be studied from a psychological point of view. Also, like financial incentives, how like taxation, again, there are psychological elements within that. And obviously the social environments, we find ourselves in institutional organizational environments and digital environments. Increasingly, obviously, a lot of decisions are made online. All of these different environments really shape and constrain behavior. So the feasibility of changing behavior. But within all of them, I would argue the psychological phenomena. And this is increasingly and quite well studied, I would say, in the health domain. So here, psychologists have really done excellent work. Also, for example, in implementation science, which I think partly is also coming from health psychology. But in the climate domain, this is less well developed. So like nudging, I don't really like that term, but like microenvironments, so how the availability of certain products within supermarkets, for example, within restaurants, that could be vegetarian, vegan options, can matter a lot, and we should study them. So the benefit of studying structural factors and how they interact with behavior is that if you can change them, you would get scalable and sometimes population level changes. And sometimes for not a high cost, other times at high cost. But the benefit of it is that you can circumvent having changed people's minds. And I think considering the time constraint we are sort of facing in mitigating climate change, we simply have to realize, I would argue, that we cannot change everybody's minds. We're not going to get everybody to become an environmentalist. So we have to speak to people where they are at the moment. We can try to pull them in our direction, if you will. But we need to find solutions that can get passed right now. And psychologists, again, can help do that. But I think we have to realize that. So I, together with Cameron Brake, again, who's in the audience, and some other colleagues, we had a small piece in the Journal of Environmental Psychology we published last year called The Case for Impact-Focused Environmental Psychology. And within that, we argued that we should pay much, much more attention to actually understanding behavior and the context within behavior or the context around behavior. So I think, particularly in social psychology, we see so many studies, experimental studies. So they try to manipulate like a psychological factor or concept that then has some sort of effect on whatever outcome they've chosen. But the starting point here is typically actually the experiment. But I think it's really important that we also take a step back and think, do we actually know behavior? Like what causes the behavior? What are the circumstances within which the behavior is performed? Who performs it? And what are the surroundings around it? Is it performed with other people? How frequently is it performed, etc.? So I think we really need to take a step back. I'm aware of the time urgency in our research because I just said it, right? But I think we need to see a wealth of studies also trying to describe and observe behavior in context, in real life contexts. Because it will, from that, we can then build more effectively and productively, I would argue, interventions ultimately that are much more targeted, much more context-specific, actor-specific, etc. And ultimately, I would also argue benefit theory. But with this sort of approach, which is much more bottom-up, much more context-specific, we will also rely on a different set of methodological tools that we have in our toolbox, or at least within social science. So it could be using interviews, ethnographic methods, just describing behavior, using experience sampling studies. It could also be agents-based modeling, other sorts of simulation or behavioral modeling tools. I think one that would help build bridges to other disciplines within social science and behavioral science, but it would also get us much richer information about behavior and the actors that perform and the circumstances within which they perform. That is ultimately steered towards informing intervention-based research. So I'm not going to talk, I could talk much more about this. So you can read the very short paper if you want more information, or we can talk about it afterwards. And relatedly, we also have to talk about what sort of outcome measures do we use in our study. So my recommendation number 6 is really we need to improve the measurement of behavior. So in psychology, I think it's pretty safe to say that we focused a little bit too much on the behavioral proxies, like intentions or attitudes. And ironically, in psychology, we have so many studies that that show that the predictiveness of one's interventions and their actual behavior is not always that strong, right? So understanding what predicts an intention doesn't necessarily tell you that much about actual behavior. And even if you measure behavior, typically using self-reports, there's a tendency, particularly in environmental psychology, which is, I would say, my home discipline, there's a tendency to rely on these very imprecise behavioral measurements. So it could be, how often do you recycle? How often do you drive a car? And then you could score it from never to sometimes to often to always, for example. And that's a very common approach in psychology. The problem is that that's incredibly imprecise. So it becomes very difficult to calculate the climate impact of different behaviors if you have these rough categories, because ultimately you need to make very strong assumptions about what did the participant mean when they said often, for example. And we can remedy this. So we can just ask, even with self-reported measure, we could ask much more specifically, let's say within the last 3 months or last month or last week, how many times did you do X? So this is the approach that they take in studies on life cycle assessment studies. And these are the ones that are typically used to indicate or calculate a carbon footprint, a person's carbon footprint, for example. These are also based on self-reported measures. It's just that they're tailored to being much more specific than what we commonly do. And then obviously, the ideal scenario, we would rely on more objective measures of behavior when that's possible. So that could be, for example, water of energy or energy meter readings. It could be you ask participants to take photographs of food waste. You could use an odometer within the car, etc. So these are possibilities. I acknowledge that it's not always possible to do that within our constraints as researchers. But whenever possible, try to see, is it possible to get a more objective measure of behavior? And the risk of relying too much on behavioral proxies, I would argue, is that it could lead to quite profound disappointment in terms of the effectiveness of the interventions proposed by psychologists when you actually implement it and try to target actual behavior. So if you say to a policymaker, we have evidence that this intervention works great on changing people's intention, okay, then they end up spending a lot of money trying to get it. It might have very limited effectiveness when it actually comes down to it. And there's a media analysis, for example, by Claudia Nisa and colleagues that generally showed that behavior change interventions are not always that effective. Again, doesn't mean they're irrelevant. It depends on scalability, cost, etc. But I would really strongly argue that we need to improve our measurement of behavior. I'm just going to run through it quite quickly. But we have a small case study that we published in Nature Sustainability earlier this year, where we looked at the predictiveness of psychological factors across 4 different outcome variables specific to clothing consumption. And we wanted to see, depending on how you design the outcome variable, how does that relate to the predictiveness of psychological factors? And what we did was essentially we included all the key psychological factors and then tailored the measurement to the clothing context. And that was, for example, attitudes, intentions, social norms, personal norms, etc. So informed by these typical behavioral models that is very common in environmental psychology, theory of planned behavior, value belief norm theory, etc. So the data we used was a survey from a survey I conducted during my PhD with some colleagues across 4 different countries. The total sample was 4,500 participants. And just quickly run through the results. On the left, you see the correlations between one psychological factor and the different outcome variables. So the points in the bar graphs, or box plot, sorry, indicates one bivariate correlation. So on the left, the outcome variable is called environmental apparel consumption. So we equate that with the typical multi-item pro-environmental behavior scale. So this is, again, like these rough frequency scales. How often do you do something like that? And what we see is that here, there are quite strong correlations between the psychological factors and the DV. But then we have 3 other outcome variables that we say are more impact focused. So the clothing purchase, we ask participants, how many clothing items did you purchase within the last 3 months? And there we see that essentially either there's no correlation between the psych variables, or that they're sometimes even positive. So in the opposite direction that we would expect. So if you indicate I have an intention to, let's say, reduce my clothing consumption or purchase more environmentally friendly clothing, that sometimes was positively related to how many items did they actually purchase. We saw the same split when asking specifically for jeans and t-shirts. And then the steady stock is where you account for how many clothing or jeans and t-shirt items participant purchased over a year, and then how many they discarded. So you can formulate what is the annual impact from clothing consumption. But essentially what you see is that psychological factors suddenly were much less predictive. And the bivariate correlations, you can see them on the right. And I should say, when we run regression models as well, with these 4 DVs as outcome variables, and we include the psychological factors alongside socio-demographic variables. Again, for the typical pro-environmental behavior scale, we see that it's highly predictive. So R squared, I think, was 0.65, whereas the other ones you go down to 0.10. And within that, you had the socio-demographic factors that were the most predictive. So this just goes to show, I think, on the scores that we really need to think about how do we measure behavior. So on to my recommendation number 7, and I think this will resonate with many of the people in the audience. I would argue, need to better understand the behavior change process as it unfolds over time. And this is obviously specifically, I would argue, relevant for behaviors that are frequently performed. So that could be, again, diet or how people transport themselves. So particularly in environmental psychology, we see a lot of survey-based results, quite similar to the one I actually just presented, where we see, does psychological factors predict pro-environmental behavior? But this doesn't necessarily tell you anything about what predicts whether you succeed in shifting your diet, or what predicts whether people fall back on reaching the goals, behavior change goals over time. And here we need, I think, more studies, ideally longitudinal or intense longitudinal studies. But because we've mostly focused on prediction, it also means that there are several highly, I would argue, relevant research questions that are poorly investigated. And that could, for example, be understanding which climate relevant behaviors people actually try to change. So we do see a lot of people are getting worried about climate change and concerned and want to take action, but which behaviors do they then select? And I already told you that there's a lot of misperceptions about what the climate impact of behavior is. So how do we change which behaviors people select and focus on? This is, I think, a highly relevant research question I haven't seen that many studies look at. And does this vary across different, for example, socio-demographic groups, or difference within certain cultures, within certain social groups, communities, etc.? But also, as I said, what predicts success or failure in changing behavior? And does this vary across different types of behavior? So in different domains, for example, or whether it's infrequently or frequently performed. And I think quite importantly, and this links back to the structural point, what is the role of external environments? So aiding or preventing behavior change over time. That could be the social or the physical environments. When I talked about structure, I mostly sort of implied that it was an objective measure, but obviously people can also perceive and misperceive features of the environments. So for example, you can have an objective bus schedule, for example, but people might misperceive how often buses run because they don't really haven't looked, or it might have changed recently. And then they think, for example, the buses don't go that often, so I'm not going to take it, or it's way too expensive. But the information or knowledge they have about it might not be accurate. So this is also a psychological potential research question. And then this is something that's near and dear to my heart, probably most provocative, if you will. So my recommendation is really that we increasingly need to study people with high socioeconomic status. And there are at least 3 reasons why we should do that. The first one is that people with high socioeconomic status, particularly high wealth or income, they disproportionately cause climate change. So they have the largest carbon footprints. I'll show a graph in a moment. Within countries, across countries. But even though they contribute the most to causing climate change, they're the least likely to be seriously affected by it. So they have greater opportunities to move. They typically live in countries that are less affected by it. They can shield themselves by having, like, for example, how they build their houses, where they build their houses, etc. Whereas if you're a poor person who don't have the financial means to move away when a serious hurricane hits your area, you're much more likely to be hit by climate change. And this was brilliantly put out or illustrated in the IPCC adaptation report that also came out earlier this year that I strongly recommend reading. And then finally, people with high socioeconomic status have a disproportionate influence on the success of failure of climate mitigation. And I'll just quickly run through a couple of these. And I should say that when I say this, I include myself, and I think most of the people in the audience. So we sometimes forget that we are a global outlier. That could, for example, be in flying behavior, how often we fly. We forget that roughly 80% of the world population have never been on a plane, for example. But to us, it's common because we work in academia, or some of us do, and there it's very common. But in Western countries, it is quite common. But at the global level, it's very uncommon. So there's a lot of inequality in carbon footprints across countries. So this is a wonderful graph, I think, from a paper that was published in Nature Sustainability this year, where the more blue the country is, the lower is the carbon footprint. So unsurprisingly, the average carbon footprint in Africa is really low, whereas in the United States, it's an outlier. I see Scotland, that's probably United Kingdom, is also quite high. Denmark, where I'm from, is also very high, etc. So, and you can see like these vary by orders of magnitude. So the carbon footprint in the average carbon footprint in the United States can be 40 times that of one in an African country. So this is a staggering level of inequality. And this just reflects current emission, not necessarily historical emissions, where we see even greater inequality. But if you then zoom in within countries, there's also a lot of inequality. So this links back to the wealth point. So the richest people within society emit much, much more than the poorest people, even in the United States, in Scotland, in Denmark. There's a lot of variability in carbon footprints. So Oxfam, which created the figure on the left, found that the richest 10% measured income at the global level contribute to 49% of emissions, whereas the poorest 50% emitted only about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, which again is a staggering level of inequality. And on the right, you see variability, for example, in the US. So the red dot is the top 10% of income. So the average carbon footprint there is 50 ton. If you then look at the top 1%, that's probably 300 tons. So bringing back that to the lower bottom 50%, you see again orders of magnitude difference within the countries. Then I also said there's inequality in the influence on climate change mitigation. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I think the paper that I wrote with co-authors is probably the one that got the most attention, where we outline 5 different roles. So coming back to the roles, where people with high socioeconomic status have disproportionate influence. Obviously, the wealthier you are, generally you consume more, you live in big houses, you have multiple cars sometimes, you fly, some people fly private, you have more money to invest, either in pensions or in stocks. If you have a powerful position, you're a well-known person, you have a bigger opportunity to act as a role model, or for good or bad. So Kim Kardashian, for example, has a massive social media platform. Some of us have okay media platforms where we can reach other people. We can lead by example, or we can sort of manifest the current or protect the status quo. Also, the higher the wealth or education, you tend to have more powerful positions within organizations. That could be as an employer, so CEO, you could be part of a board, or you can be just middle management, but still you have more leverage than the typical factory worker. And then finally, as a citizen, the sad reality, even for us living in democracies, is that some people have more of a voice in terms of which policies are passed. So if you have a lot of wealth, you can contact policymakers directly. I wouldn't be able to reach them. If you're a Koch brother in the United States, or the Koch brothers, they've had so much money they invested into academia, think tanks, etc., that have been very influential in getting or protecting fossil fuel interests. And if you are Leonardo DiCaprio, you have an easier time to rally around your interest. He generally, at least on average, tend to use them for environmental reasons, which is good, but others don't. And then the final recommendation I have is that I think we need to be honest and transparent about the generalizability of our evidence. And this relates to behaviors, so the behaviors we study. There's a tendency to use these multi-item scales. I think that is not a beneficial or the best strategy, because it might be useful for saying that a psychological factor is relevant for pro-environmental behavior, but it's very unspecific because it's a formation of sometimes 15 different behaviors, and they will not be equally relevant for all of them. So it sort of gives the idea that our research findings generalize across these different behaviors, while they might not. But then also, and this is a common discussion in psychology, so you all know it, we cannot assume that the effects generalize between different population segments. So if you study school cheaters, it's not going to necessarily apply to investors, or if you study the average person, it will not necessarily generalize to the highest income people within a country. So we need to better test and embrace for these heterogeneity in effects. And then the most common one is obviously we cannot assume generalizability across different contexts unless we actually studied it. So what applies to Denmark might not apply even to Sweden, and particularly not, or definitely not Spain, etc. And it certainly won't apply to Mozambique or something like this. So we cannot assume psychological universality in our evidence unless we have evidence to support it. And that also means we have to increasingly focus on doing studies outside of Europe or United States. Although I should caveat that by saying that probably one of the only research topics where you can justify only using weird samples would be in the climate or environmental context, because these are the people who cause climate problems and environmental problems. So just to conclude, I have like my hopes for the future, reflecting what I said so far. And I think my hope is that we really can shift focus on high impact behaviors across individual roles. So you can continue with what you've been doing already, just shift the outcome variables or behaviors that are the center of your research. I think we need to make descriptive and observational research much more sexy. There are some gatekeepers to that. I'll talk about that in a moment. I think I would love to see that whenever in our studies we specify the behaviors that we studied, that we would have like a paragraph, a short paragraph to say, what is the environmental impact of the behaviors we study within the study context? So sort of justify why we chose this specific behavior and how it relates to the environmental problems or climate problems. And obviously we cannot assume generalizability unless it's warranted by the evidence. I would say we really need contextual evidence, and there's a lot of value, even though most psych journals don't value it, there's a lot of value in contextual evidence because it's much more relevant for policymakers. So if you say that you did something across a whole spectrum, or like an IMTUC sample, policymakers will be less impressed than if you can say, I don't know, I did it within this very specific constituency that you care about. So we have evidence that this relates to the voters that might vote you out of office or into office. And obviously, and this is very easy to say, but I think we need better coordination and synthesis of research efforts across different countries and research groups. Again, the health domain is pretty well developed here. So the Human Behavior Change Project, I think it's called, by Susan Mickey, for example, and is a beautiful illustration of that. We don't have that in the environmental domain. I think there's a great need for that. And critically, we need to increase interdisciplinary interactions and collaborations. And there's also a demand for from other interdisciplinary research projects to include psychologists. But because we might have relevant knowledge to offer, but we need to reach out. And we also need to show humility, obviously, in participating in such interdisciplinary projects. So I just want to point out that, because I got this feedback, and I think that's very legitimate, that it's easy to point to like problem spots and opportunities without sort of acknowledging why sometimes things are the way they are. So obviously it would be ideal, but we have like funding constraints. So it might not always be possible to run well-powered intervention studies with the actual behavior, because it's just not possible. It takes a lot of time, and that can be risky, particularly if you're an early career researcher. And we have to acknowledge the very skewed academic incentives. So there's an incentive to publish in certain journals, and they only accept certain types of papers, etc. We are typically valued by where we publish and the citations we get, not necessarily by the impact on society that we have. And applied and interdisciplinary research might not be equally valued in different departments. So sometimes psychology departments, again, evaluate your scientific merits based on the journals you publish in, and they might not, so applied and more interdisciplinary journals might not be ranked as high. So that can be a challenge. But also doing interdisciplinary collaborations can be risky and challenging, but they can also be hugely rewarding. And no discipline can solve a problem as complex as climate change. So we need to work together across different disciplines. But this is a barrier to progress, but one I think we need to overcome. And that was all I think I had to say. Thanks for listening.